Greetings, all. Welcome back to another episode of the Coptimizer Podcast. I've got another awesome guest. I know I say this every episode, but I'm just thrilled and excited to have a fellow Indiana chief on the call with me. And we're going to jump right in. Chief Shawn Keene, welcome to the Coptimizer Podcast.
Hi, I'm glad to be here.
All right. So when I introduce you as chief, you really are a chief, but you're kind of like in between two worlds right now. You have a very unique situation going on. I just throw that out there right up front. But Chief Keene was the chief of the Terre Haute, Indiana Police Department and was recently going to retire, but he has an offer to work as a chief in a new agency, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. So he's actually going to be transitioning police departments, which is not something that's too common in a chief's career. I know there are chiefs that travel and go to different agencies, but I think in Indiana that's not something that's that's very common. So
yeah, I'm not familiar with anybody ever doing this before. At least after 26 years with one agency, yeah, it's probably pretty unique, I would guess.
Yeah. All right. Well, I just wanted to get that out of the way right up front. So we'll come back to that. But again, I do really appreciate you spending some time to get on the show. Chief Keene and I we've crossed paths many of times over the years. I think like a lot of us do in law enforcement, whether it's at training or different events. But we both spent time in the SWAT world with the Indiana SWAT Officers Association and just different events, and then later down the road in the career as police chiefs, serving together on the Indiana Association of Chiefs of Police board. So, yeah, this will kind of be a fun conversation because I think you're the first chief from the Chiefs Association that I had on here, and maybe we can give a little inside ball later.
Yeah.
Thrilling, exciting stuff that happened at Chiefs meetings. Hey, before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? And let's touch on your career. And everybody when they join police departments, they dream of being a chief someday, right?
I can honestly say I did not. That was not my initial plan coming in.
That was sarcasm. I'm sorry. My sarcasm sometimes is a little dry. Anyway, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I have wanted to be a policeman my whole life, honestly, since I was probably 10 or 11 years old. After I graduated from high school, I joined the Marine Corps, and I did so with the hopes of being a military policeman. And I was fortunate enough to do that. I was stationed in Hawaii for a good portion of my time on active duty. I worked for the Hawaii Armed Services Police my last year and a half, which was a joint services police department that dealt with military members who were arrested by civilian authorities, the Honolulu Police Department specifically. So I came back here afterwards. I was born and raised in Terre Haute, and I came back after the Marine Corps. And I put my application in with the Terre Haute Police Department. While I was going through that process, I did work for the Department of Corrections for about 9 months. So I just long enough to know that I was not cut out for working in a place of incarceration. It just didn't appeal to me. So, but I have been with Terre Haute since April of '98. So this April will be 26 years that I've spent on this department. During that time, I've worked in both the uniform division as well as the criminal investigations division. I was a member of the Special Response Team, or SWAT, for 17 years. I left as a commander in 2017. And then I've been a member of the Honor Guard for about 18 years. I was assistant chief over the investigations division for 10 years. And I was a chief here for the last 5 years. So I've got a little experience in just about every area on the department at this point.
Well, you're probably the only one in the department that worked for Hawaii 5-0, right?
Yeah. We didn't quite call it that, but yeah, that's a good call.
That's kind of what it sounds like.
Yeah, it was interesting.
My wife and I, we just we celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary. And she had a milestone birthday last year. I won't say what that is, right? Because you're not allowed to talk about that stuff. But we had planned on doing a trip to Hawaii for a long time. So we did that last year. So that was the first time. I'd never been to Hawaii and got to spend 3 weeks in Hawaii, and
Oh, wow.
a few of those. Yeah, it was kind of cool the way it all worked out. We did the Norwegian cruise, so a little shout out to Norwegian, and for anyone that's thinking about going on a cruise. If you've never been to Hawaii, it was a they had this island hopper cruise where you fly into Oahu and you depart from there, and then you hit four of the islands, and you sail at night, and then during the day you do excursions out on the different islands. So it's kind of cool because you get a chance in 7, 8 days to be able to experience all of the islands. Now we knew since we were going to be heading all the way out there that we wanted to spend more time there. So we actually through a friend and a connection who lives part of the year on the Big Island, we wound up after we were done with the cruise, we went to the Big Island for 8 days, I think, as well. So my point in saying all that is we went in a few days early because I'd never been to Pearl Harbor. So that was a bucket list item for me, was to go to Pearl Harbor. So we did spend several days on Oahu. We went to Diamond Head. We went to, I think the other one is called Cocoa Head, which is another hiking trail. Got to see a lot of Oahu, and it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. And you talk about the Big Island. That's when you get there, I did a couple training deployments there, and you don't expect to see cattle. If you go up towards the volcano, I don't know if you got to see the lava fields and stuff there, but
Yeah, we did.
it's not what people think about when they think about Hawaii typically. It's definitely different.
No, and we did go up. We did spend a day going up to Kilo, which is like to up to where the um, telescopes are and the observatory, and
The snow.
yeah, that's crazy. I mean, it's it's a lot. I've been to out west. I've been to a lot of mountains, but that was just so unique because you're going literally from sea level down at the ocean all the way to, like, 14,000 feet. It's definitely a different experience. It feels like you're on the moon when you're up there too.
It pretty much does, yeah.
So before we move on though, what was everyone, the idea of living in Hawaii obviously is very appealing. And what were some of the things that you enjoyed the most about being in Hawaii, and particularly with what you were doing?
Honestly, the weather is, I was there 3.5 years. Um, and the weather was always, 70s or 80s, just the perfect all year round. I don't think I had a cold one time the whole time I was there. Just beautiful weather. You can wear shorts the whole time. The weather, and like you said, there's so many trails and things that you can hike on there. Just there was always something to do. Even after 3.5 years, you're finding new things that you hadn't seen before. So it was just that experience, and that's something, when you're 18, 19 years old, that only the military is going to be able to get you to a place like that where you can actually afford to live there and enjoy those sites for sure.
Did you surf at all?
No, I wasn't a surfer. I watched some people do, especially on the North Shore. Some of those waves got pretty good.
Oh my
Um,
gosh, yeah.
yeah, but not me. No, never
I
took it.
we went on we took a spring break trip to Costa Rica a few years ago with I have three boys, and we went surfing, and I actually loved it. I had tried when I was younger. When I was in the service, I lived in Charleston, South Carolina, and there's not a lot you don't get a lot of surfable waves in
Sure.
Charleston. And Costa Rica was different, but then, man, when we got to Hawaii, some of those, yeah, especially on the North Shore, when you see some of those waves, it's like, yeah, no, no.
Yeah, especially get into the fall, October. They're really, they're scary. They can be if you're not an expert for sure.
Yeah, so just show a little love to the surfers out there. But I can see myself, I can see myself, getting a big longboard, um, and then maybe on over on the Honolulu side. I just, it was such a cool thing to see and experience. There's so many people that would be up at 4:30 in the morning at sunrise. They paddle out, and you would just see groups of 30 or 40 people together out there on the surf.
Yeah.
And, something about that was just, it was pretty cool. There was a very strong pull, like very relaxing, very kind of, like a very centered life approach. So yeah, I definitely think there's something to the island life. And if you've never been to Hawaii, you should spend some time and go visit.
Yes, absolutely.
And the weather, like you said, is a little bit different than Indiana.
Yeah, just a little bit. Yeah, especially now. And
Yeah, now that we're in February.
yeah.
But we did have a thunderstorm here this morning, and I joked with my wife that I almost got hit by lightning walking out to my car, uh, which was just bizarre as it is in February to have a thunderstorm. That doesn't
Right.
happen very often. But it was one where I've had some close calls before, but that made me a little bit nervous. It was the flash and the boom at the same time.
Mm.
Needless to say, a little extra pep in my step to get into my
I
gladiator,
bet you did. Yeah.
get myself grounded. So, so you started at Terre Haute PD in '98, and how long were you in the Marine Corps?
4 years active, and then I was in the reserve. I had a 4-year component that was reserve time, inactive reserves. So
So you were in the reserves. You were still eligible then when 9/11 happened. Did
uh,
you?
no, I actually was done in 2000. So I did a year
Oh,
in the
okay.
delayed entry program from 92 to 93, did the 4 years of active duty, and then 3 years additional inactive. So I was done in 2000.
Did you have uh, did you have any desire to re-enlist after 9/11?
I did. I thought, well, if they call people back, I'm ready to go. I'm still young. I'm ready to do it. They obviously didn't need me, so I didn't go. But yeah, I think everyone had a sense of patriotism at that time. Especially if you've been in active duty before. But yeah, I had that same experience. Yeah.
I uh I was an FTO at the time, and I still to this day I can tell you where I was. I was actually asleep when I got the call. It was from a friend of mine. I was working nights, and the night I it was a day I had court, and so I had gotten off a couple hours early so I could go home and get a couple hours of sleep before I had to get up and go to court. And then my phone was ringing. I think it was supposed to be in court at like 11, but my friend was calling me after the first tower got hit. And, I wake up, number one, and just, he was screaming at me over the phone and, upset. And I knew something was wrong. Like I thought, it was something different that he was calling about, but I, I I think I only bring that up because that was such a pivotal time in law enforcement. It really changed the way that we approach a lot of the things that we do in policing. And it's kind of one of the things I want to touch on later, just in terms of how things have changed, really, just in the course of your career. Just from a preparation perspective, from an equipment perspective, a mindset shift, all of these things. I, you know, I I told that recruit that I had to apologize to him at the end of that training cycle because I was like, I think I just did the worst job I've ever done with any recruit with you
Mm.
because we were driving around. I don't people remember like night shifts around here were pretty busy. I mean, it's a busy agency, and but it was just there was nothing going on. I mean, there are no cars out on the street. It's dead quiet. It was just very reminiscent than what we would experience later during COVID, during the COVID lockdowns, when things like that's what it was like for the first few weeks after 9/11. Maybe you had similar experiences down there in Terre Haute, but it
Yeah.
was a very surreal kind of bizarre atmosphere. And of course, we were all very distracted. So thank you, to the criminals of the world for taking some time off
Taking a
as
break.
well. Um, so what? So your first few years, I know we all have a kind of a very, you know, I think similar path where we work in patrol, we go to investigations, but um, what I from from your early time in patrol, Yeah, did you have like a desire? I mean, you're coming from the Marine Corps, so yeah, yeah, there was that type of mindset definitely transfers into a, into a specialty role like SRT, SWAT. So was that something, was that a career ambition of yours when you became a police officer?
When I first became in '98, we didn't actually we had a TAC team, but we never had what I would call SWAT or a special response team at that point. I did have a desire to do that. In 2000, they formed our first one here. Um, and I tried out for it and I was fortunate enough to make it. But yeah, I mean, all the same things, like you said, the military experience that you have, the camaraderie, I got a lot of that fulfilled by being part of the special response team. Um, and that was early on. I think like I said, in 2000, I had a couple years on when I made the team. I was very fortunate. And we definitely had some changes over that time. I think our first team we wore our duty vests underneath a mesh outer carrier.
Yeah.
Had an old van that looked like the A-Team van. That was just we didn't have a whole lot of equipment back then. Yeah.
Dun, 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 dun. Did you guys have a cassette tape in there that you could play that?
And we might have had an 8-track in here. I'm not sure. It was pretty old.
Yeah, that's kind of funny. I do want to touch on a few of those things, but nowadays kids, they look at like my son wants to build out my oldest son, he wants to build out a Sprinter van and customize it, and he wants to go travel and see things. And I'm like, back in the 70s and 80s when I was a kid growing up, it was a different kind of conversion van, and teenage boys and young men wanted those vans for a very, very different reason.
Yeah, you're right. It's funny you talk about that. I told you I teach at ISU, and it's so weird because I can relate to you about we can talk about the A-Team and TV shows and things, but I mentioned something like that and I forget that those kids are 30 years younger than I am and have no idea what I'm talking about half the time. So
And they
uh,
look at you with blank faces like,
yes, and then I realize, yeah, well, they don't know what you're talking about here. So
he's so old.
yes,
And you're like,
exactly.
I'm not old. What are you talking about?
Mm, yeah.
Um, well, so on the SWAT thing, and this again, I think, and this is kind of a byproduct of 9/11. The gear, I have a couple of pictures hanging up here in my office of the early SWAT days. And for those of us that were in the service prior to joining SWAT, like I had a lot of like some of my camouflage clothes. So you just had this mismatch of different uniforms that
Yeah.
people would wear. Um, and our agency was fairly progressive from a SWAT standpoint. They had a team back in the 70s, and yeah, it kind of went away for several years. I'm not I don't know and I don't know the history of why it did, but um, it got brought back, fortunately, I think in a much more organized fashion in the early and mid 90s, and it progressed from there. And one of the things that I really like to, and I talk a lot about this at citizens academies and things, and maybe you do something similar, but the progression of the professionalism of SWAT, um, and there's everybody. Well, we can make the joke about the original SWAT show on television. You bring that up, and kids today would look at you like they're thinking like the modern show that's the reboot show that's been on for the last couple years. Um, but yeah, SWAT it was a different type of thing back then, and the investment just wasn't there. And it was, and I had a lot of concerns uh, early on in terms of, the way that like the differences that I saw in the way teams trained, like the standards that they had or lack thereof standards. Um, and over the last, I think the last 20 years, there has been just a huge shift in the level of professionalism.
Yeah.
And that all really just it starts with leadership and an understanding that this uh, it's an important role and it's an important gap that communities have to have a response for. And even back then, in the 90s and early 2000s, that was an evolution from the 80s. Yeah, I mean, what does the team look like now in Terre Haute compared to what it looked like when you first started, like from an equipment and a training perspective?
No, it's completely different. I mean, even tactics, you talk about that, in the late 90s, early 2000s, I can remember going to the schools, and a lot of what was taught back then was the dynamic entries. It was just dynamic on everything. We go in as fast and as hard as we can. And that has changed so much to, more of a surround and call out in most cases because it's safer, the tactics are better, and it's not worth losing someone over, some drugs.
Right.
So I saw that the tactics changed, but like you said, the equipment also changed significantly. Um, Back then, like I told you, we had just our duty vests, we had an old van. Today, we have a Bearcat. We have a second armored vehicle that is we're able to get with grants through, and it's just we additionally have an equipment vehicle and a negotiator vehicle. So today's team versus back then, we have now two teams that rotate call, 8-man entry teams. Um, we have a commander and assistant commander that look over those two teams, and then we have 5 snipers and then 5 negotiators that again rotate call. The equipment now that they have, everything from the equipment on the Bearcat to there's a lot of use of drones and robots to go in areas, so officers don't have to take that risk, so that we can have some view of what they're going into. But you're dead on with that. It's a more professional. The tactics are 100% better than they were 20, 30 years ago, without a doubt. It's a big change, though. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have a friend of mine that's in the SEAL teams, and we were kind of talking about this early on, like a lot of the military special operations worked. They still to this day they work with SWAT teams and local law enforcement when they're training domestically and stateside when they're on their training rotations. But a lot of the tactics that, and actually, I picked this up from Phil Singleton years ago. And Phil, he was a former British SAS uh, member who was, I think, famous for being on the Iranian hostage rescue. But he taught a class for where it's sub gun instructor school where he primarily using the MP5, the H&K MP5, which by the way, still to this day is my all-time favorite gun. They wouldn't give me one when I retired. I don't know why, but
Can't imagine. Yeah.
actually they transitioned out of those a few years ago, but I still love that thing on a side note. But originally a lot of the tactics were that they were developing in those communities came from lessons learned in law enforcement and domestic SWAT teams, like in New York, Los Angeles, other your major metropolitan areas, and others. And there was that big shift, like you're talking about the speed, surprise, violence of action is what we
Yeah.
call it when you're going on these dynamic entries. And a lot of that stuff made famous from movies that we saw from the 80s and
80s.
90s where cocaine, like Miami Vice type stuff, where the cocaine bust and drug raids. And I'm not saying there isn't a time for that type of response, but it certainly evolved. And the reason I mention that is in talking with this friend, we were just chatting about tactics. He was curious about what we did in domestic law enforcement, and when in the early days in Iraq when they were doing a lot of their raids on high value targets, they were running that same type of with that same type of operational mindset. And he said what they found quickly was when you do that, you kind of announce your presence, and when you're in unfriendly neighborhoods,
Yeah.
it's not the entry that you have to be concerned about. It was the exfil when you're trying to leave an area when you've woken up the entire neighborhood. And they just found, right, like they really transitioned a lot to even some of those similar contain and call out. Of course, every operation is going to be different, and
Yeah.
every call out is going to be different. But it's a lot safer, not just for the officers, but when we talk about priority of life, it's, the suspects are included in our priority of life. Innocent bystanders are always the number one consideration for any SWAT or police response. So it kind of, after you kind of go through all these different I don't know, iterations or um yeah, I don't know. Let's put it this way. What was do you remember your first call out as a member of a SWAT team?
Oh yeah, it was a controlled delivery of I think it was some type of drug. I can't remember what it was, and we had to wait for them to open the package, and then the search warrant allowed us to go in. And it was just like said, you know, it was as fast as we could go and as hard as we could go, and it was your adrenaline's pumping, but over time you start to realize that was probably one of the worst decisions you can make tactically for that specific scenario. But you never forget your first one for sure. But I still remember that. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, what drove a lot of it too was like, when the ram hits the door, the suspects are primed as well and they're ready and so in every op plan that we had, there was always a plan for how do you get to the bathrooms as quick as you can because the eight balls are going down the toilet. So,
Yes.
and it's, you think about it and but when you're a young officer and that's kind of like, man, we got to get the dope to make the case. And when you think about how you're prioritizing the way you're going to build your entry, it's like, well, maybe that wasn't the smartest way.
Smartest
And then
thing.
yeah, so we started doing things, just breaking rakes on windows and clearly, hopefully, if you had like I don't want to get too far into tactics, right? But if you knew that there was a bathroom, on a ground floor level, that was one of the areas where you were gonna do a break and rake and contain and at least keep someone from coming into that point. But all right, I got to tell this story because it kind of goes to how the mindset and the shift from a command perspective. And I say this, this is not a disparaging remark about a former chief or deputy chiefs or command level people, but just the mindset, and the shift in tactics and the way that you think about approach. We had a case. It was one of my first call outs where we had a suspect. He was attempted murder suspect, a serial rapist that our detectives had tracked down. It was in a house in our downtown area. And so we had uh, our team got deployed. We set up. We had containment. We had our sniper observer teams were out. We had our inner perimeter set, and we're there. And uh, we had command staff personnel walking around like inside of like walking right past like our inner perimeter and where we had set up and just walking around out in the open and stopping and talking to team members like, oh, hey, what you guys
Mm,
doing here? Like, come on. There's a reason why we're where we are, right? And yeah,
right.
just crazy kind of stuff. But yeah,
Yeah, I
that
think
was,
that's.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, when I did ultimately leave the special response team, I left as a commander, and it was I knew that it was I was leaning towards taking over for chief. The current chief had run for sheriff, and I knew that was going to happen. And I knew that I had to separate myself. Though there's a difference when you become chief, you have to have trust in the people that you've trained to come up and take over that. And it was still hard after 17 years to leave SRT. Um, but you have to respect them. And like you said, the command staff has to show the respect that those people need and to let them do their operations and not try to micromanage things. Um, but it definitely was a hard thing to walk away from for sure.
Yeah, that's a great point. And there's a huge leadership lesson there. I have another story about that as well. I was very fortunate to work with a couple of really, really good leaders and um, that were, not only just at the shift level, but our commander at the time, um, when we were going through this transition process, he had come to our agency from LA County Sheriff's Department. He was from around this area. Life brought him back into this area. He came to our PD. So he had been exposed to a lot of the operations and the way that, LAPD, SWAT, LA County Sheriff's Department, they had trained. So, one of the first things that he did was it was a revision of our SWAT handbook and our operation, our SOPs and the professionalism that that he expected from us. He was also a military officer, so on top of good policy and adherence to policy was also a very strong orientation to leadership up and down the chain of command. Very, very early proponent of the every officer a leader type of mindset. And so it was, I was very fortunate. And then I had when I became a team leader, my team commander at the time, former Army Ranger, ton of really, really good experience. So I was just blessed to have, to work on a team with people that were interested in being, professionals, not just, we were a part-time team, but, that we didn't think of ourselves that way. We trained really at a standard where we felt like, if it doesn't matter if you're a full-time team or a part-time team, when you have an operation and your results are going to be judged on the basis of your response, not well, you don't get a pass just because you're a part-time team.
Right.
There's no one going to say, oh, well, it's okay. You
It's
guys
okay.
shot the wrong person or breached the wrong door because you're just a part-time team. You don't get those types of allowances, and nor should anyone ever expect that. But we we had I want to tell the story because I later wound up, I became the team commander. Generally what happens inside of organizations, for people that are listening, is people promote up and they move into different assignments that pulls them in different directions. And sometimes, SWAT is a very, we train to NTOA standards for a part-time team. So we were training over really, we exceeded those hours. So we were training over 200 hours a year, which is a lot. That's a big commitment. And um, sometimes if you're running a team in detectives or doing other things, that's just too much. So you have to make sure you're balancing what your responsibilities are. But I wound up being team commander, and we were actually at the SWAT officers annual conference down in Indianapolis. When we got called out, we had a homicide subject that was barricaded in a house. So we had to, literally our whole team had to respond back from Indianapolis. So patrol did a great job. Our detectives did a great job. They had good containment. And we get back, there's a big dog in the house that we have to account for. We go through all our planning process and everything. And my former team commander, who is now the chief of police, comes into the command post, and as we're getting ready to go live on the operation, he starts asking me questions. and and I just said, yes, sir, we have a plan for that. Yes, sir, we have a plan for that. Yes, sir, we have a plan for that. And there was a moment in this exchange, yes, sir, we have a plan for that. And of course, I was following that up with what we were going to do. And I think he got to about the third or fourth question, and he had this realization that, okay, I've trained him. He knows all these expectations. And I'm telling him, yes, we have accounted for everything. We've gone, we take this serious. And he just looked at me and smiled and just basically stopped talking in mid-sentence and just walked away.
Good for him.
Yeah, it was, and it was kind of a cool moment because right then and there, I knew, like, he trusted me, and he trusted the process that he had built. And, everything is a process. And if you trust your process and if you put the right people in the right places, then you got to, at some point, right? It's like being an FTO. At some point, you got to cut the cord and you got to let the officer go out and patrol the streets by themselves and just and trust in knowing that you've done the best that you can to equip and resource them and train them. And yeah, I know it's kind of a long aside, but not, not every leader is like that. And not every police department. I think we've gotten a lot better, but yeah, there was a time where I really questioned a lot of that.
Yeah, I think for sure. I mean, like you said, if you're a leader, you have to trust that the people that you put in those positions know what they're doing. Um, because if you don't, then really the issue is more with you than it is with them. But it is
Right.
hard to step away from that. Like you said, when you leave a team like that, and it's hard. You have to learn to trust, and it's still difficult when you walk away from something like that after so many years.
So when I had to step away, and again, this was an assignment where I went from patrol to a multi-jurisdictional drug task force, and they told me you're not allowed to do both. So I had to give it up, and the officer that got selected to replace my spot on the team, I still remember it to this day, but I gave over my gear to him, and it was like this moment where, I'm giving him, where just like you guys, we had started with kind of makeshift, right, standard body armor with, different type of exterior vests. Like sometimes you were pulling your panels out of your one carrier and putting them into another that's where you can carry your SWAT gear and stuff like that onto where we had evolved to every SWAT officer is has a take home car. They have their gear that's assigned to them, their go bags, everything that with tactical, you know, ballistic vest and helmets and everything that you need and that you would expect that your SWAT team members would have. But the hardest part for me was handing over that MP5. I was just like, oh my gosh, like this is like my baby. I gotta give it up. He still works at the PD. He's still down there, and for every once in a while, I have to remind him. I'm like, man, it was like when your first child goes off to college or to the military for the first time, and you go behind a closed door. Like, it was real at that point. Like uh, I digress. I'm sorry. So from okay, and then the last story, and this kind of brings it home. And I like to kind of tie into current events because I think sometimes in the policing world, I like to make the comment that policing in America has never been better. It's never been more professional. We're better equipped. We're better trained. We hire great people. Doesn't mean that you're not going to have failures and you're not going to have people that that break the law every once in a while. You're talking about close to 1 million people out here doing this job, so you're always going to have things like that. But every once in a while, you kind of see some things and you're just like, man, how does stuff like this still happen? I watched a SWAT raid, or I don't think it was a SWAT raid. I think it was a narcotics raid. I just watched the video yesterday, and I wish I could. I don't even know where it was. I saw it on LinkedIn, and there was someone that was making a comment about it. But it was took about 10 to 12 hits on a standard apartment door to breach the door and get the door open, and it was a dynamic raid in this day and age. And the first person after the door got breached, she came running in, and I'm still not convinced. Like I watched that video a couple times. I'm like, I don't think the point man had a gun in his hand. I
Wow.
think he ran in. Maybe it was hard to see. He might have had a small handgun in his hand, and I just couldn't see it. But I mean, he was into the house by himself. He's 30 feet deep. And there was an interior camera in the house, and that's where the entry was caught. And I think the point of the story was really about, it was a no-knock warrant. They were pounding on the door. There's a question about when they actually announced that it's the police, and did they really say we're the police? Um, yeah, I wish I had it. I would queue it up right now and play it and watch and get so I could get your like raw, candid reaction like the first time you watch a video. Just to So it just goes to show you that sometimes it seems like for as much progress as we make, yeah, it seems like every once in a while we just take a big step backwards.
And
Right.
it's so frustrating, like you said, because we have come so far and we know that, those of us in this field, we know it, but everything's on, there's always a video somewhere, like you said, that'll pop up that shows us a utter worst. And then, you just cringe because you're like, no, that's not what we do 99% of the time. And, but to the people that don't know, I mean, they see that and that translates to, well, they all act like this, so I feel you. It's so frustrating to work so hard, like you said, and have that 1/10 of 1% occur, and it's on video, and um, it just becomes frustrating for the rest of us, to try to be professional all the time and to have that happen.
Did you see the video of the acorn incident?
I I didn't. I've seen some memes or something, making fun. I don't exactly know what happened, but it doesn't sound good for sure.
No. Yeah, it's not good. It's one of
No.
those where you're just like, and it's worse when it's inside your own agency, right? When you see something and you're just like, oh,
Oh yeah. Yeah, and I
um,
think we've all experienced that from maybe not to that degree, but for sure. But
oh, and I've experienced it to that degree, unfortunately. Um, but that maybe that's a good segue because that's kind of one of the things that I really wanted to touch on with you is you have a ton of experience. You've got a lot of wisdom and knowledge. Uh, and to the point is in policing, we can train hard, we can get all the best equipment, we can do everything the right way and still have bad outcomes. Um, and you, but as a leader, you have to manage your way through those because there is no other choice, right? And leadership is a choice. You're going to decide to do it and do it to the best of your ability, or you really need to let somebody else, step in and take over and do it. And you've had some pretty unique experiences that I wanted to get to. Um, I guess as a lead up to that, when as you progress through your career and experience some of these things at the really at the officer level, and then as you progress through like into detectives and eventually into administration, what were kind of some of those like pivotal inflection points in your career where you realize, okay, like, hey, there's a better way to do this, or if I'm ever in a leadership position where I can affect change. Do you remember like any specific points in your career where you're like, we're going to do things differently, and this is why?
I can say without a doubt, probably the biggest thing for me where I saw a change was, I talked about being on the honor guard for 18 years, and so as a young officer in patrol, um, I would go to a lot of officer involved or I'm sorry, officers' funerals that have been killed in line of duty, um, and it was an honor, to be part of that and to go and represent our department, and they if you've ever been to one, which I'm sure you have,
Yeah,
you know,
unfortunately,
it's
too many, right?
yes, and you experience that, and it's the emotions are so high there, and you see the family members of the officer who was killed, and you see the reactions, and you all the other officers, and you're there to support them, and you have one view on it when it's someone that you don't know, and I don't mean to belittle that, but it's you go 10 years of going to funerals and things, and it's hard. You see it, you feel it, um, but it completely changes when it's someone you've worked with for years, and you know them, you know their family. It's a complete different dynamic, and I don't know how to explain it. But it's almost like this isn't real. This shouldn't have happened. This, it especially the first time you lose one in the line of duty. It's very difficult, and then you start to question, well, what could we have done differently as far as helping or supporting the officers that are here that have gone through this. Um, did we do enough to prepare? Because until you experience it, you don't realize how inadequate you are for the task. As an agency, the single agency, no single agency, in my opinion, can handle that by themselves. And that's why, when we lost our first officer with the FOP coming in and their team, we couldn't have survived that without them. I mean, they were absolutely, the rock that we needed. Um, But that first one, you realize that I need to be better prepared for this. This is not, you never wanted this to happen. You never dreamed it was going to happen, but you better be prepared for this, in the future. Unfortunately, we've lost three in a 10-year period, which is not something I ever want to experience, again, and no agency ever would. But you don't want to get good at preparing. Don't get me wrong, but you need to be prepared because just like we were, it had been 20 years plus when we lost our first officer. Since we experienced that, most of us never knew what that was like, let alone prepared for it at an administrative level. And it changes how you move forward. It changed for us how we looked at not just when we lost an officer, but when our officers started to be involved in deadly force situations where they had to use deadly force. And are we taking care of them the right way? Are we looking after their mental health? Because honestly, prior to the loss of the first officer, I think, it was one of those things where you have to be tough as a policeman. You can't let your emotions out. And I think it started to kick in. We need to think more about our mental health. We need to think more about our officers and making sure we're taking care of them at that level. And it's not something traditionally that policemen want to talk about. It's hard for us. So I think that's probably the biggest example of realizing that we are woefully inadequate, at least at that point. We need to do a lot more to take care of our officers and their families. So that's without a doubt for me, that's been the biggest change where I realized we needed to do more.
Yeah, and so I want to dig into that a little bit because I think there's some analogies that you can make that that by far certainly that's I think was one of the worst things that you could ever experience as an agency is to lose someone in the line of duty. Um, but I was in another episode that I recently recorded that'll be coming out like at the week before this episode comes out. We were talking about crisis response and responding to active shooters, and this is the guest Todd Langley. He was on an episode last year, but this year we wanted to follow up a little bit on on this preparation and the understanding that these are incidents like that are very fortunately it's a very it's a low frequency event, very low frequency, but it's a high consequence in many different ways. So no community ever really expects or wants that they're going to have an active shooter. But if you do have one, if you are not prepared, if you have not been training in advance and preparing for it, then your response is going to be suboptimal. It's going to be very difficult to have a good response if you're not adequately trained. And there are so many things that go into training like that and preparation like that. And we could go down this whole rabbit hole about about investment in policing because, and again, it even starts with the expectations from the community about what do you expect in these types of response and where do you want your police to focus their attention, because if you don't have even a good focus, it's hard to even know where to start. And there's only so many resources to go around, so you have to make some prioritization decisions about what you're going to do. But there's a very similar, I think, preparation mindset that has to occur for these types of things too, in terms of when the active shooter event happens, or like the example that we talked a lot about was Uvalde. From the outside perspective, that was a failed response for a lot of good reasons. But we look at that as a singular point of failure. Oftentimes, the media looks at that as a single point of failure. And my argument has been for years is like that's not, that's just where the failure was exposed. The failure started way upstream from that, from community decisions, political decisions, investment decisions. Long before you even get to the level of a chief, where a chief starts to make decisions about how he's going to prioritize, and then where it moves, into the chain of command from there. So I guess maybe the area that we can, without going too far down that path, for your experiences and what one of the things that I was hoping that you would be able to share with us today, or other chiefs or other listeners, those in law enforcement, the time for training and preparation for a critical incident like that, where you do lose an officer in the line of duty someday, it starts today. It doesn't start the day that it happens, and it doesn't matter where you are on that continuum today, from whether you feel like you've done everything you can and you're prepared, versus, oh my gosh, we're woefully underprepared. Today we need to start, because if you wait, like, hey, hoping that it's never going to happen, hope is not a plan. And Murphy will find you if he knows that you're underprepared or unprepared. So what were, I guess, maybe, and again, I've you've been in my prayers a lot over the years. I from the Coptimizer perspective and a cop optimization, I've had some guests on where we've kind of talked about this, lead yourself first type of mentality. One of the things that I get very concerned about when I look around the country here across the state, in trainings and stuff that I do when I'm traveling, is I see a lot of police chiefs that are not in very good shape. Their health doesn't look too good. And that, and people like to make jokes about it. Oh, the fat cop eating donut, donut eating cop. I'm like, what they don't understand, that there are biological mechanisms at play, and there is stress at play, and there are things where I do think there's opportunities for intervention. So, like, we don't lose police officers to things like coronary artery disease and heart attacks and cancer and stuff like that can be a byproduct of the stress. And so it's kind of this is it's a long lead up to asking the question, like, how do you, what would your recommendations be for if like you have a new chief that's taking over your police department, most likely a pretty seasoned veteran. I've met him, right? He's a seasoned, officer that's coming in. He's not new to the profession, but he's coming from inside an agency that's had to experience this. But a lot of police departments have never experienced that. And, most police chiefs, knock on wood, will go through their career and not have to experience that. What would be your advice to new chiefs or leaders that are coming up through the ranks, and people that might desire to be in the chief's position someday, about how to prepare, and some things, the considerations, things that you learned in your career?
I think without a doubt, the best thing that you can do first, the best tool that we have to make sure you're prepared for most anything is, the accreditation process, and making sure if you have an agency that's not accredited, that they're not abiding by best practices. That's the first step you need to start taking. Now, when we get into critical incidents like this, when you think you have a good plan, you need to constantly reevaluate that and see if you can't do better. And what I mean by that, from the time we lost our first officer to the third, and hopefully the last, was that we had a 10-year period. And each time, throughout that period, we would learn a little bit more. And even more recently, one of the things that I did was, we have a social worker program here now. And half of that responsibility for the social worker is worrying about the mental health of our officers. So now, whereas in the beginning, we might designate a psychologist for the police department so the officers can go if they're in a critical incident and talk to someone. Now we will have that social worker come to the scene within 20 minutes and meet with the officers and do an initial assessment and make sure we're getting them help immediately. So anything that you can do to constantly improve on what you have to better take care of your officers, the better off you're going to be. Don't settle for, okay, yeah, now we're here, we're good with this. You have to constantly reevaluate that. And, if services and technology becomes better, you have to apply that to what you're doing for your officers. Don't ever settle. I learned a little bit, from IACP alone, different meetings we've had. Doug Carter from the ISP. He came and introduced us to talking about, when officers are killed, do they have basically a set of directives that they want? And you should talk with your officers before it happens, so those things can be settled. And until he said that, that's a really good idea. And we started incorporating that into our officers. Each year we would send it out, through our accounting software. Hey, do you want to update, your line of duty death information? And, just things like that. Constantly look and strive to improve upon what you have. Don't ever settle, because the second you settle, you're going to come into some circumstance that you're like, I wish I would have done that. And I think your officers deserve that, to do the best, improve, and constantly look for ways you can improve what you do to provide them those services.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so this is where, where I try to advocate very strongly for not just chiefs, but for up and down their organization. And this is where the community, plays a part too. And when it comes to training and police budgets, yeah, most people don't realize there's very little discretionary uh, dollars available to a chief of police for um, actually what they want to spend their money on. I had a $22 million budget, and 92% of that is accounted for, through salary and benefits and fixed costs that come with just this that are associated with your people. And so now I've got 8% that I've got to buy bullets, I've got to buy cars, I've got to buy computers or different things, and not to have a show. Maybe I should have an episode one of these days on just budgeting alone, because it's a big stressor. But the training budget is generally very small, and it's for every one thing you say yes to, you're saying no to five other things. So, and this was again another discussion that I had with Todd Langley, and on that last episode. Wow, it is so important to engage and get your networks of people that you can trust, that you can lean on from around the country, not just in the state, but around the country. And that's where programs like the FBI NA, Northwestern Staff and Commands, Southern Police Institute, and others. It is so important to get your people involved in these organizations so they can build out their networks, and so you can share best practices. Um, even for if you're in an agency that's not accredited, making sure that you're operating under best practices and that your policies are vetted every single year. It's not every 5 years, and that's kind of the way it was back in the day. If you even had I've talked to police officers that are, what are you talking about? Like an SOP manual. Like they didn't even have SOPs. They didn't have a policy book. They
Yeah.
didn't, and you sometimes you forget when you come from an agency that is pretty well resourced. Not every agency is in that position, and people are just they're scraping, and they're doing everything they can to get by. So a long way of saying, build your networks, identify the people that have knowledge that you don't have that you need, build a relationship with them. So when the time comes, you can lean on them to help you, because that's everyone out there wants to help. But in order to do that, you have to be a little bit vulnerable. You have to be willing to go out and say, you know what? I feel like we've got a great police department, but man, this agency is doing this far better than we are. So let's learn from them. And what you just talked about is the line of duty death form. It's a very comprehensive form that someone in your organization needs to ensure that every officer that's working under your supervision has completed that form. And that's updated on an annual basis or a biannual basis. You might not have to do it every year, but it's got to get done once for sure, and then it needs to be updated, because Sometimes, people get divorced. They have changes in their personal life. Their addresses change. Their insurance pack benefits change. Their personal desires, like, do you have a living will? What are, where do you want to be buried? Do you want to be cremated? All of these things um, that you don't think much about, and you hope that you never have to think about it. But if you don't plan and prepare for it, then someone else is going to have to do it for you. And it can cause a lot of stress. And I'll just tell you this from a personal perspective, like, one of the greatest gifts that my dad, I think, gave us as a family, I'm the youngest of eight, was he had a comprehensive living will. So when he lived almost 90, and when he was at end of life, he was suffering from some medical conditions that made, it having told us in advance what he wants done, exactly how he wants it done, then when there's no question about what you're going to do, you just honor the wishes. But if you don't have that stuff done in advance, then someone's got to guess for you, and that can create some conflict in between families and between, even organizationally speaking, like everybody's got their own opinion about what they think the agency should do, right? So it's always good to set expectations right up front. Like, this is what the agency can and will provide. This is what the FOP can and will provide. Um, this is what we need from you. So you guys did that. That's good so you did that in your enterprise system, like Tyler Munis or something like that.
Yeah, we use it in our scheduling software. We have that as well as our inventory, and that form will come up annually. The reminder that you need to update it each year, and it'll keep giving you that warning until you at least acknowledge it. So
Yeah, and again, here's one of these fun little leadership and supervision lessons. It's like somebody's got to follow up on it. Somebody's got to be responsible for making sure it gets done. And I know officers sometimes get frustrated when they think like, oh my gosh, we're out here running the street, handling calls, and you admin guys are sitting in there in your hands, just, inventing shit for us to do.
for us to do, yeah, I hear it.
Yeah.
So,
No, there's a reason by it, and I was always, you know, I tried to be as intentional as I could about that. Like, always thought about, like, how's this going to affect the officer in the car? And you never forget where you come from, even though people sometimes will assume that you've forgotten where you've come from. Um,
yes,
and that's yeah, I can't say that. Yeah, I'm sure I made my fair share of mistakes along the way, but that is, I think so. That's step one, quite frankly. So if you're listening to this and you're an officer or a commander and you've never filled out one of those forms, um, that there's IACP has a ton of resources available on that. Just a quick Google search and you'll find 100 resources that'll be right there, and even just best practices for preparing for line of duty death. I know that the FOP, the national FOP, our state FOP, they have great teams that are already set up, and this is one of those things, like, don't try to reinvent the wheel. It's there for you. Utilize those resources and make contact. Have a designated person inside of your agency that's going to be responsible for that. Um, and I think most agencies do, but I know there's some out there that are listening right now that they probably haven't done it, and they're hoping that, well, hopefully this won't happen here. Um,
absolutely. You got to make those contacts. And the time to make them is not when you're in crisis. You need to know beforehand, like you said. That's critical.
so um, I had the honor to watch you give a high stress presentation recently. We don't need to talk about it, but one of the things that I was really that really struck me that day was listening to your thoughts on this very task, and the personal impact that that it will have, not just on your agency, but as a leader of an organization, and how you responded and prepared for, not prepare is probably the wrong word, right? But really, how do you react to it? Um, so, the next question along those lines I wanted to touch on was, you said something when you were notified of one of these incidents where one of your officers had been killed in the line of duty, the prioritization in your mind for where you wanted to be and what you wanted to do. Can you kind of touch on that kind of process? I'm trying to, and if I'm getting too personal, you just tell me to shut up. I just think it's, to me, you said some things that I hadn't considered, um, and I hadn't been forced to consider it, and that's where it's like it's I'm not in a position where I would have to manage it now, but I want those insights because I do coach and I work with a lot of police leaders now and police officers, and it was something that really struck me that I thought was really powerful.
Yeah, I'll tell you one of the things, and you probably wouldn't think about it till you experience it, because as a leader, in a law enforcement agency, one of the things, we've got our checklists. We're sitting here thinking, oh, critical incident. Now I've got to make sure I need a tactical response, or I have this, I've got an officer down. One of the things that I've learned through this process is that information is going to go out very fast. You're not going to be able to control it. I mean, you've seen with social media now, um, how quickly information gets out. And when you have an officer that's been, wounded in the line of duty or even killed, um, one of the first priorities that you might think about is you need to get someone with that officer's family immediately, because the last thing you want them to hear is to see that on Facebook or social media, and it will travel fast. In some instances, it's 10, 20 minutes, the name is starting to get out there. And it's frustrating because you're like, why, everyone wants to, get information out there. Sometimes we have
Yeah.
people that don't think when they do that. So that's going to be one of your, I realize that is a critically important task as a police leader. You need to prepare for that immediately, and you need to get someone headed towards the family immediately. And that's why those line of duty, that information is so critical in listening to what the officer wanted. You want to get, if it's a spouse, maybe it's someone that's not married, but has a girlfriend or boyfriend, or whatever the situation is, you need to act on that immediately, and don't let them find out through social media or a newscast, or one of these auditors that follows the police around. That's not how you want that family to hear that information, and that's not what we owe that officer. So that's something that you may not think about that in your checklist, but it's something that through experience, unfortunately, we've realized here is a critical task that is going to need to be addressed immediately. And you still have to notify your other people, like we said, but you've got to think about that family immediately in the process.
Yeah, it's such a great piece of information. You know, police officers are no different than any other, you know, individuals inside of organizations. You have the formal communication networks, you have the informal communication networks, what we refer to as the gossip tree, the gossip train, and um, it's amazing how fast and how far information will travel inside of a police department. And for every step that it moves away from the source, there's
Yeah.
there's information that gets added, there's things that get um, subtracted. So by the time you're two or three people removed, um, the information is no longer valid. I would even say one step removed, it's no longer valid. And unfortunately, that can have some, I don't think, I don't think sometimes employees really think about the ramifications downstream of what the impact of them, the need for them to get on their text message and send a text message, or on their MCT, or pass on some information. It goes to one person, then it goes to five, and we know how that like it spreads like wildfire, and maybe without necessarily considering what the downstream ramifications might be. So, in addition to that, having a plan, or getting an officer to the family as quickly as you can, because family and we're just talking like immediate family, like spouse,
Yeah.
children, but there are parents, and then there's in-laws, and then there's brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles. And man, that's it can go a long way. It would, and I think anybody would want, and deserve and expect that, they get to hear the information first with the most accurate and reliable information that we can provide to them in the moment. So that's something that can be incorporated into training when you're training on the line of duty death. We can incorporate the responsibility for communication, who's responsible for what, but then also educate all of our employees on the gossip tree. Uh, and I actually made a point in my last couple of years where I actually had a class that I taught in our all-day training about formal communication, informal communication, and the gossip tree. And at part, I kind of felt like I shouldn't have to do this, but then I realized, it's a good thing to do, and I probably should have been doing it my entire tenure as a chief, not just my last couple of years, because as a chief, I'm sure you're aware of this, right? By the time information gets back to you, sometimes it's a head scratcher. You're like,
Yeah.
where in the hell did you hear that?
That, yes.
And while this is, not a fun topic to talk about, I don't mean to make light of the topic, but from the gossip tree perspective, we know how quick, how far, the old saying is, right? Um, a lie can travel around the world before the truth has time to put its pants on, so um,
I would add that, once you've prioritized the family's notification, before you do any release to the media, um, any of that information gets out, what I would do is the next step is to notify your officers and your staff at the police department. Once the family's been notified, even if it's not necessarily line of duty death, you have to understand the impact on the other officers. If they hear that an officer has been shot or injured, or there's been an exchange of gunfire, that affects them and their mental health somewhat. So you have to address that next. And
that's a
typically
great
what we
point.
do then is we're going to put out that email to everybody on the department notifying them. Hey, not necessarily it's going to interfere with any investigation, but hey, officer so and so was involved in this. He or she's okay right now. We'll update you more as we get more information, but this is the information we know. Because we've had so much feedback over different incidents where officers say, hey, I didn't know what was going on. I just had to see it on the news. So, we think of ourselves as a family in law enforcement, especially within departments. Make sure, family and then the officers. And then one other group that I like to notify is our retirees. I've worked over the last couple of years to put together an email distribution for our retirees. You talked about it, but just a few months out, you feel like you're just cut off from everything that's really been your family for so long. And some of them have relationships with the officers that are still on. A lot of them do. So I'd like to notify them too, to make them feel like, hey, you've served for 20 or 30 years. You're still a part of this family. This is what's going on. And same can be true for, if we have someone, a retiree that's ill or injured or going through something, I like to put that out to everybody else so that they know. And then, and only after that, then, your media releases go out as far as when you release a name or something like that. But that's just kind of how we prioritized it here, just through trial and error learning mistakes.
Yeah, those are all great suggestions. And yeah, now in hindsight, I sit here and think, man, I wish I would have done a couple of those things, because um, and that again, it's like sometimes you don't know what you don't know and you hadn't thought about it, but that just makes great sense. That's a great piece of advice. So so with that in mind, so you have the forms, you have the training, you have the communication, not just with the families, but the internal communication, because that kind of goes back to, and again, this is where, like, when you're talking about the informal networks and the rumor mill, if there's a, you know, if there's a gap, then somebody's going to fill it, and information is going to fill it. And sometimes that happens internally. And all the best intentions sometimes can go sideways on you. And then eventually it's going to get to the media, because that is the media. And then you mentioned the another group, the First Amendment auditor groups. And that
Yes.
was, and as much of as a pain in the ass those people are, um, yeah, I'm probably gonna have to do an episode or two just on that topic alone, because that's again one of those unintended consequences of people that, and look, I think some of the people that do that actually do it very well. Because, but I've been exposed primarily to people that do it, you know, they're just shitty people and they're doing it for
Yeah.
all. And I can say that now because I'm retired and I don't care what they think of me. Uh, I hope some of them are listening, and I can say, go find something better to do with your time. It's like, God, nobody walks into a classroom and sits there and yells at a teacher while he's trying to teach a class, right? You suck at algebra. Hey kids, you don't have to do addition. You're never going to use that in your life. Like, it's kind of a silly analogy, but it's true. It's like, man, who wants to be yelled at when they're out there trying to do their job, and then for people to hide behind, that, oh, we're just First Amendment auditors. No, you're not. You're profiteers exploiting an opportunity to go out and make money and be jackasses. Um, Now, for those that are doing it right and doing it the right way, that are just, hey, I'm just trying to educate the public on what it is, police officers are out here doing. There is kind of a raw type of experience that you can gain from people that are just watching the action as it unfolds, unfiltered. It's when people start the interjection that I have a problem with. But I digress. But in terms of this conversation, the reality is if somebody is out there filming it, then you really don't have any control over the information. And I'm not saying that you have to have control over the information, but you have to understand where this is going to go. And the media is the same way. And it's, like, I'll go make a SWAT analogy, right? Um, we've had a couple of these incidences where it's why it's important to have good relationships with your media, but we've had incidents where we've had barricaded subjects, violent barricaded subjects that we know are armed, and they're filming us live while we're outside, moving around. And sometimes people forget, like, well, suspects have TVs in their house too, and if they see the news cameras out there, the first thing they're going to do is turn on, and you get that feedback through your negotiators. Like, um, so having a plan for how you're going to communicate, what you're going to communicate it, and when, I think is really important. Is there, as we're kind of sitting here spitballing this, um, any other thoughts that have kind of crept to the surface about things that you think, chiefs and others should consider in these circumstances?
To put it in perspective, I would say, I'm talking about, family, officers, retirees. But in reality, that notification has to be very quick because, as you said, in the absence of information, you're going to get, um, rumors and other things that can do damage too. So you got to be prepared as soon as you're done making those notifications. You have to give a release to the media, and that will help quell some of those rumors and other things. I mean, you can imagine, all it takes is one person on Facebook giving the wrong name, and then that family is exposed. And so you have to be prepared for, what you're going to release to the media, prioritize it, and all this really is going to have to happen in, a very short time frame. You've got to get that information out. Um, by far for me, the most difficult one was when we lost our first officer, and it was, I was at the time the SWAT commander, so I was part of the tactical response, and the chief at the time was out of state. So I came in very quickly, had to change clothes and give a release, which I had never even thought about, and that was absolutely challenging. So if you're an administrator, you really need to think about that. Even though you never want it to happen, you should be prepared for it. How you're going to do that, what you're going to say, be somewhat familiar with what they're going to ask you. Because the wrong response during an interview, and you're going to have media from all over, it won't just be your local media. Um, the wrong response can come out wrong, and it can be devastating to your agency, to that family. So the time to think about it is not when you've just been into a critical incident, you lost an officer, you've got all that going around in your head, and now you're in front of 12 or 15 members of the media from all over, trying to convey what has happened, at the same time being respectful to your officers and the family. So you're absolutely right. You have to be prepared for this, even down to what you would say in those instances and what you wouldn't say. The time to think about it is not at the time it happens. Yeah.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And I think it's something that often gets neglected by not just chiefs, but by people that are, PIOs or others that are going to be responsible for that community facing face and spokesperson for the organization. It's okay to have rehearsed statements. There's nothing wrong with that. And it would be good practice to have those done in advance. So maybe as part of in your critical incident response plan, that whether it includes a line of duty death or not, it might be one of these cases where you have uh, an officer involved shooting, to have the a canned statement prepared, something that you can read and practice and rehearse, and then you customize it to the circumstances that you have. But you have to know in advance what you're going to say, what you can say, what you're not going to say, and why you're not going to say it. Because the community, despite what sometimes where they feel like we're trying to hide things from them, they deserve to know what happened, and they deserve the truth about what happened, and they deserve to get it as quickly as you can. But they also have to recognize, and the media has to recognize, and this is where relationships come in, that there is an investigative process that must be respected, because justice is, hanging in the balance.
Yeah.
And officers that are involved in critical incidents are entitled to due process the same as anybody else would. And it's important that we run those investigations. And so, that's, the time to ask yourself, what can I release and what should I release and when, is not when you're under the pressure
Yeah.
of the moment. You got to do that in advance. So again, this comes back to a training. It comes back to networking. Make sure that you're getting that type of training done in advance. If you're responsible for setting up the training, make sure that you're seeking out great sources to do this. Yeah, because yeah, it's
I
too
would,
late in the moment.
and I would add one more caveat to that is that, our agency, like many, you may have a designated public information officer. You may have a few like we do. But there are certain things that when they occur, the public needs to hear it from the chief executive. In my opinion, and those instances are, when you lose an officer in line of duty, if one of your officers is accused of misconduct, if something happens and that occurs, they need to hear from the chief executive, in my opinion. Or if your officers have been involved in a deadly force encounter, where deadly forces have been used, in my opinion, those circumstances, that's where you as a chief have to come forward and talk. That can't be put on to a PIO. There's many things a PIO can do, in my opinion. They can do releases on burglaries and robberies and shootings and things that we do, but there are certain things, in my opinion, that the public expects and should expect the chief to be front and center and providing that information. And I think those three, that's been my rule always. Those three, they need to hear from the chief. That shouldn't be put off on a PIO to go up and explain to the media about alleged misconduct or about a deadly force encounter with one of the officers, or you lost an officer. That's, in my opinion, when you need to hear from the chief. That's just my 2 cents on it.
No, I agree. I completely agree. And it's one of those things too when yeah, it's no fun. And um at some point, probably on an episode, I would want to talk with the officers involved before either that I had got into any specifics on cases. But it's just they're anyone can get on YouTube and look up and find information after the fact. But the truth is like this. There's nothing that's not going to get out there eventually anyway. So it's it's important, I think, to make sure that and I always just kind of said, like, as soon as you can, you need to rip the Band-Aid off. Um, don't let a wound fester underneath the Band-Aid. And that's, so if there's bad news, you need to give the bad news, and it needs to come from the chief. And what I like to do is in preparation for those is have as much stuff as I could prepared in advance that I could give members of the media as well. Um, and that's, and I know the media professionals appreciate that when you're well prepared and you give them everything that that they're going to ask and what they're going to want and what they're entitled to, have it prepared in advance for them. So when they come to your press conference, you can, and plus I think it eliminates a lot of conjecture and guessing. Um, and
Yeah.
that's and again, don't be afraid to practice stuff like this. And watch chief. It's not just chiefs, right? Police officers loathe to be critical of other police officers. I think it's one of the problems that we have in the profession is that sometimes we don't like to speak out when we see something that we disagree with. And I think, and one of the reasons why is because I think we're all concerned that we know that on any given day there's something that can happen inside of my organization. I might even do myself that's going to receive a high level of scrutiny. And nobody wants to be told you're a dumbass. But we're all going to be a dumbass from time to time. You just got to prepare as best you can for it. But I think it's also we have to do in policing. I think we have to do a better job of growing a little thicker skin too, and being able to accept criticism. And I'll just one more thing. Actually, Todd and I were just talking about that last week. Is and I think I was just the benefactor of good processes from a SWAT perspective in doing after action reviews. And I know that's something that's it's a standard practice inside of tactical teams. And I know the military is also a firm believer in that process. It might have even originated from the military and worked its way into law enforcement. But after whether it's in a training iteration or whether it's an actual operation, we would sit down, and generally when I was team commander, I would just start, right? And in that after action room, there's in those reviews, there's no rank, there's no structure, because everybody has a responsibility and a job that they need to do. And you have to take ownership for what you did well, what you didn't do well, what you did, when you did it, why you did it. And we have these very candid, and sometimes those discussions can get pretty heated. And there's some candor that goes on, but we also you develop a level of trust that like what's said in the room stays in the room, and you're doing it not to be hurtful or spiteful. You're doing it to improve performance and to drive better performance the next time you go out. And that all starts with accountability. And especially if you have rank, right, you have to be willing to receive the critical feedback. um, and I think sometimes other parts of police organizations don't they don't have that opportunity to have that kind of exchange where you do just kind of all the rank gets put on the table, and we just we have those candid conversations because we can benefit a lot from that.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things too that I'll throw in there that, after you have something like that, one of the things that, especially when you lose an officer line of duty, there's a debriefing that's not concerned with necessarily tactics, but we've had those with counselors to address, mental health issues and how people felt afterwards. And those are good ways where you can identify if someone uh, may need some additional help. And it's important not to leave anybody out of those. We've had one after one. We lost an officer in line of duty where there was, 15, 20 people in the room, just talking about what they went through. And again, it's not necessarily a debrief as far as tactics or what we did right or wrong. It's more of how we felt afterwards. And you usually have a counselor that leads those discussions. But that can be a very important step in that too. You don't want to leave anybody out and assume just because, someone was a dispatcher or someone just showed up to transport someone, that they weren't exposed to something, that they don't have some issues with what occurred. So you want to make sure you're taking care of all your people and everyone has a chance to be part of those debriefings as well.
Yeah, and at least I hope, I think most agencies now probably do have these critical incident debrief processes in place. They usually have it, hopefully they have it in policy as well. And we're doing a much better job. And I think I think we were on the path there, but I do give a lot of credit to the Obama administration and the 21st Century Policing Initiative, the 6 pillars that they identified, officer safety and wellness being one of those pillars. And me, my role with the Wellness Committee for the State Chiefs Association and just my passion for that. I typically, I came from the physical wellness, the exercise, nutrition, the resiliency side from that. And I learned a lot in that process and reading that report in terms of, okay, where in things that I personally hadn't considered. But we had some, again, I'm just a benefactor of some really good people that came before me too, that were very forward thinking, doing things with, emotional survival for law enforcement. Dr. Gil Martin, we had him out very, very early in his speaking career and issuing that book to all of our officers. We have a program where we do that with the families as well. On New Hire Day, they all get a copy of that. We have one of our police psychologists does a presentation for them. But it's, the point is, every year, take a look at what you're doing and take a look at how you might be able to do it better. Look at what other agencies are doing and build on that. Because I think in policing, we all like to share. If we're doing something well, we'd like to share it. And if we're not doing something well, what we like, this is sometimes where I don't think we're good at this. We're just not good at telling people like, hey, I don't think that you should do that. And this is why. I don't think that's a good idea. What we do is we generally let them figure it out on their own, right? And we could save people, I think, some headaches. And I know people could have saved me from a couple of headaches if they'd have just told me, hey, Chief, you might want to consider this. Oh, yeah. Thanks for telling me after the fact.
Yes, yeah. Thanks for that.
All right. Well, we've been going for a while, so let's change gears just a little bit before we wrap it up. But again, I really do appreciate you sharing that, because I know that's those are tough things to experience, and there's no doubt in my mind that there's a part of those incidents that's going to stay with you forever. It never goes away. But how you manage that, I think, from a resiliency and a preparation perspective, and just, sometimes it just takes some time to really kind of put the pieces of the puzzle together and put things into place so you can move forward in a productive way. All really, really important. So from just from a personal perspective, would you have any insights in terms of like, what are just some of the things that you did personally to help you negotiate, those challenges, because it is lonely, in the Chiefs position, and those things sometimes can fester.
I can tell you that if and hope nobody has to experience this, but if you do have the loss of an officer in line of duty, the first 4 to 5 days, depending on how things flow, um, you're going to be pulled in about 50 different directions, and you're going to constantly be. And again, thank God for the FOP team, because without them, they come in and they do this step by step by step. You're going to go through that initial the crisis, and then you're just going to be pulled into this process that requires you to be here, here, here. You've got to get this done, this done, this done. You're going to get a list of tasks that you have to do, and you're going to try to manage all that. The best advice I could give you is, stay focused on what you need to do for your officers, and to recognize, the family, the officer that you lost, but also get some rest. Set out some time to get some rest in there. Make sure you rest each day, because you're not going to do anybody any good. If you're exhausted and you can't think straight, it's going to be hard. It's going to be difficult. But those first few days, just expect that you're going to be pulled every direction, and you're going to have a list of things you got to do. And it's going to be like a blur when you think back, 5, 6 days down the road. You're going to think back of what all you just did. And it gets difficult then too, but don't be afraid to reach out if you need to talk to someone too, because like you said, it's being the chief, everyone's going to turn towards you for the answers on things. But you also have to take care of yourself and recognize that, mental health is something that we all need to keep in check, and you're not any different than any other human being. You're susceptible to the same things they are. But it is, like I said, it'll be a blur, and you'll look back on it and wonder how you got through all that. In retrospect, it's different, but you've got to take care of yourself also. Get the rest. Talk to your family, especially your spouse, if you can. I made that mistake the first time. Just focus on everything we did, and not enough communication there. Those are important things. Just don't forget to take care of yourself in the process. Would be my best advice.
Yeah, and I know that can sound like it can sound a little selfish to say that, but I think the point that you're making is so incredibly important, is that you're no good to anybody else if you can't manage yourself. So either, there's the idea of what other people expect from you, and then there's the reality of what you're capable of providing. And so that's where all of the things that we talked about leading up to this are so important. Having a process and a system in place. Build it now. Don't wait for a crisis to happen. Have something prepared for yourself, even if it just means you as the chief sitting, taking a couple hours one day, reading through all the best practices and putting together a list and a file that you keep on your desktop, on your laptop, somewhere on your phone, kind of, it's like break glass in case of emergency type of file that you can then go back to, because you're not going to be, it's going to be very difficult to think, in terms of, logically, it's going to be very emotional. So have that done. And then, the couple that making sure you're blocking out time for sleep, for, setting up a window, having, creating a space where even, even if you have to, if you have to talk to a medical provider or one of your police psychologists or something like that, something in order for you to rest properly. I mean, that's, the first thing that goes is logic when you're tired. So it's hard to access that prefrontal cortex when your amygdala is firing in overdrive. So from a resource perspective, you guys are an accredited agency, so I assume you're looking at the ILIAC or the Indiana accreditation and the CALIA type of accreditation programs. So that's a resource. Do you have any other resources that you would recommend, or is that just, you think that's probably a good place for people to start?
I think it's a good place to start. Each community, each agency is going to be different on what resources you have locally, depending on your size and your location. But evaluate those now before you have an incident like that. Talk to your officers, what have been their experiences with the different treatment providers in your area. We had an issue where, one of those providers um, was lumping our officers in with people that they had arrested, in different areas, and that turned them away from getting help. So I rely on feedback a lot to realize if, we need to switch something up or get them sent to someone else. And we did that. We made adjustments. But look at what resources you have in your community and make sure through your officers that through feedback that they're actually willing to go to those people and talk to them. Otherwise, it's you're going to have to make a change.
Yeah, that's really critical. And sadly, there's a lot of communities where they don't have those resources locally, so they're going to have to travel for them. Your
Yeah.
smaller communities are going to have to either going to have to travel or they're going to have to bring somebody in. Either way, make sure that you are working on that. The 21st Century Policing document does have a lot of good resources in there, so I would recommend people read that as well. And I know the IACP, International Association of Chiefs of Police, they have some good documents in their protocols as well that you can jump in there and all those best practices. And then, and I think most people are probably aware of this too. But if you're not a member, I would strongly suggest that every agency have at least a couple of people that are members because they have shared the shared policy forums and stuff like that where you can jump if you're doing research on new programs, pilot programs, what are people doing? You can really jump on there and see what others are doing. And generally, and if all else fails, right, pick up the phone and call someone in your network and just, start the conversation. Because if the person you call doesn't have an answer, there's a good chance that they know someone that they can point you to. And that's, so that networking becomes critically important. But all right, we're at 90 minutes, and it seems like it always goes so fast when I'm having these conversations. But I like to wrap it up with just kind of a few questions for you. I think it's public now, but if you want to maybe take a minute and just tell us what's next for you and what you're going to do in your career and
Well,
what's coming.
so the day before yesterday, the mayor of Westfield announced that I would be taking over as the police chief there on April 8th. So that's exciting for me. It's a very fast growing community. And I'm looking forward more than anything to getting to know the officers there. I'm really excited about the opportunity to continue to serve in this profession and to continue to be a chief. And it's just going to be an exciting chapter for me. I've worked for the same agency for 26 years. So it's going to be very exciting for me and my wife to have this opportunity. And I'm looking forward to it.
That's pretty cool, man. I'm so excited for you. And it's yeah, the average tenure for a police chief, there's a couple different sources I've looked at, but it's depending on what you look at, it's generally 3 to 4 years. It can be a little bit longer. I think they think agencies over 1,000 officers, historically it tends to be a little bit longer, but a lot of that it has nothing to do with performance of the chief. It really has, we work in, chief is an appointed position. And so we are subject to the political whims of a community. So if you have a change in leadership in your city management, city government, then that generally leads to changes in your police departments. And so sometimes that can be a good thing. Sometimes it can be a bad thing. Regardless, when it comes to policing, it can guarantee that there's always going to be change on the horizon.
Yeah.
So you just, but I worked for the same agency myself for 27 years. I've oftentimes wondered what it'd be like to dip my toes back in and go to a different agency and try it again just to kind of see what what that experience would be like. Because, and I'm not going to put you on the spot here, I'll just tell you from my perspective, when you come from inside of an organization, you know all the players, right? You're intimately familiar with the ins and outs of the organization, who's done what, who's doing what, training, experiences, knowledge. You've got a very comprehensive feel. Coming from the outside, um, it's just the opposite. You don't have those relationships. So there is a sense of freedom, I would assume, that comes with that, in that you don't have some of those emotional connections, but that presents its own set of challenges in and of itself, like where you have to spend the time to get to know those things. Um, so I do think overall, I do think policing could benefit from a little bit more of that free agency, so to speak, at the upper administrative level, where you get to you get in exchange ideas and experience and vision. Uh, I think I think internal candidates, have their strengths as well. So this is
Sure.
well, what we'll have to do maybe is think about having you come on like a year from now and say, hey, so what was what's the transition been like?
Sure.
All right. So um, you're right there at Indiana State University, and maybe we should have led with that, right? Terre Haute, where Terre Haute is.
Yeah.
It's in Indiana. It's in the on the I-70 corridor in the west end, about an hour due west of Indianapolis. There is a federal supermax prison close to Terre Haute, right?
Yes.
Some famous prisoners. Timothy
Uh,
McVeigh. Who else has been there?
well,
Unabomber.
this is the only prison in the United States that does executions, is the Terre Haute Federal Prison. So all executions are done here. So anyone who's subject to a death sentence as it gets closer to that date would be transported here. So we've had to, like you said, going back to McVeigh in '01, um, anytime there's an execution, it happens here. And we are the primary agency responsible for, assisting the federal prison with that. So,
And I didn't want to get into that, but community corrections, prisons, they're suffering a lot of the same challenges that police departments are. They're really struggling to get people to
yeah,
work in those environments. That is a very tough job. And again, it's one of those, I think you know, we probably need to make a better investment as society in how we're going to pay, um, treat, train, prepare those employees, because that's a difficult environment to work in.
yeah, as I said earlier, I did it for about 9 months and I give them all the credit in the world. I wasn't cut out to be in that environment locked up all the time. And I applaud those that can do that, especially spend 20 years in a career there. I think they're wonderful. It's just not something that I personally found that I could do. So I appreciate them.
Yeah, it takes all kinds. Um, so in your you have a master's degree. I know you're a lifelong learner. What's if you had to, well, let me ask you this question. What's the last book that you read, or what are you currently reading?
Honestly, textbooks because I teach at ISU. So unfortunately, most of my my time is spent reading textbooks and preparing lesson plans for classes. So, um, gosh, I can't think of the last time. It takes up so much of your time as far
What's a
as
good
reading.
textbook? What's a good police textbook?
My class is based on police administration. Can't remember which edition we're using now. Actually, I may have it right here, and I do. So, yeah, this is the textbook I'm using for my class, and it's generally I found most of the chapters that I use in there are easy to relate to what we're actually doing in policing now. So, um, it's a different generation, so I definitely learn probably as much from my students as they do from me, I guess. So, it gives me some insight into the mindset of the new officers that are coming on, how they're thinking and approaching and looking at policing as a profession. So that's been an interesting thing or an interesting experience for me because, like I said, it's you can learn as much from your students as they do from you, just by learning how their mind processes information and what they're looking at in a career. So
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah, I never really thought about it from that perspective. Um, all right. So when you so you're going to have some pretty good suggestions for which books you're going to include in your promotional process. I don't know if you ever go through that, like, when you're building your exams for your promotional process, which textbooks you use, which administrative books you use, and there's some good ones out there. Um,
Yeah.
so
Here I mean, our merit board has the final say in the hiring process as far as the testing. They have to vote and select which one, but they do, come to us for input from time to time. Um, so that's a whole other process.
so no pleasure reading, huh? Like
It's
you
been a
like to read
while. I mean,
like fiction? Okay, all right.
sadly, yeah, most of my pleasure reading is probably cold cases, and you know, I still can't get away from the profession sometimes. So
Well, that's how you learn, right?
yes.
It's a all right. So did you well, what if we could even say Netflix, Prime? There's some really good true crime podcasts that are out there, some true crime
Yeah.
uh
I got some
series.
documentaries.
Yeah. All right, what's your favorite true crime documentary that you've ever watched? If you say, hey, if there's one you have to watch, this is it.
Um, there's been so many. I can tell you which one is probably my least favorite.
All right,
Um,
go right there.
it was probably that Making of a Murderer. You remember that a few years ago?
Oh yeah, the one from up in Wisconsin. Is that
Yeah,
Wisconsin? Oh, the Wisconsin? Yeah, I think it was
it's-
Wisconsin.
yeah, and it was you watched it and you got this whole perspective, and then you find out later that it was all very slanted from what actually happened, and it was made to give you leave with a certain feel of it. So ever since then, I've been a little skeptical of some of those documentaries.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, they
so
pull people in, and you have to always here's that you have to remember that it's entertainment.
yes,
Yeah, this is as much as it is for information, it's entertainment, and it's like any other case that you work, right? You know, follow the money.
yes.
Who has the most to gain from this story, and why? All right. So that'll be our last piece of advice for our listeners this week. Um, most of our listeners are cops anyway, so they they're probably they're tracking right along with us. Um, so yeah, so when you're watching these with your spouse and your loved ones, and they're going, "Oh my gosh, you guys, you're putting all you do is go out there and put innocent people in jail all day long." Because if you follow the mainstream media, sometimes that's all we do. But um, maybe that's unfair. I digress. All right. All right. I'm going to shut up. Shawn, I really appreciate you spending some of your valuable time with us. It's it's a little bit of a dark topic to talk about, but it's so critically important. And I think if we were to sum up in our 90-minute conversation into like 30 seconds, it would be prepare in advance, make sure you have good SOPs, make sure you have good policies, make sure you understand them in advance, make sure you have a plan in advance. Don't wait until crisis hits to try to develop and negotiate that, because that's the old saying, right? Failure to plan is planning to fail. Any parting words?
No, I just want to say thanks for having me on. I enjoyed it and forward to
Appreciate it.
watching some
Semper Fi.
Semper Fi.
And appreciate you appreciate you, and I'm looking forward to seeing how things progress, and I know we'll be chatting soon, and I'll see you around the bend. But thanks again for spending some of your valuable time with us, and until the next episode, we'll be 1042.